לפרופסור מרסל מחלוף על ההרצאה המאוד מרתקת ומעניינת וקצת שונה ממה שאנחנו בדרך כלל שומעים כאן. אחר צהריים טובים, שמי תומי שטיינר, אני איש המכון למדיניות ואסטרטגיה בכנס הרצליה, ואנחנו עומדים בפתחו של אחד המושבים המרכזיים שלנו היום אחר הצהריים, המזרח התיכון, הכתובת על הקיר, שאני יודע שהיא קצת כותר מושב, קצת עמום. אולי נבקש עוד מעט מראש המכון ויושב ראש הכנס, האלוף גלעד, להסביר את טיבו של שם המושב הזה. וברגע שיאמרו לי שאנחנו מוכנים, אני גם אשמח מאוד להזמין את הדוברים. אנחנו הולכים לעבור מספר סוגיות, מספר נושאים בסדר היום של המושב הזה. זה בסדר. אנחנו נדבר על 3 או 4 שאלות מרכזיות. האם אנחנו צפויים לשובה של הטלטלה האזורית? אנחנו נדבר על מעורבותם של מעצמות ושחקנים חיצוניים במזרח התיכון, ולבסוף ננסה לחשוב קצת קדימה, לשאול מה הם השינויים האפשריים, למה צריך להתכונן ועל מה צריך לצפות קדימה. 1, 2, 3, אני חושב, אנחנו יכולים להזמין. וברשותכם אני אעבור לאנגלית. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to invite the distinguished panel to join us. First of all, our moderator and Herzliya Conference Chairman, Major General Amos Gilad, please. Mr. Tamir Pardo, the former director of the Mossad. Mr. McGurk, this will be his 3rd appearance at the Herzliya Conference, the former special presidential envoy for the Global Coalition to counter ISIS, who is now at Stanford. Dr. Dalia Dassa Kaye, the director of Middle East policy at RAND. Ambassador, yes, applause are welcome. Ambassador Husain Haqqani, the former ambassador of Pakistan to the United States, and now with the Hudson Center, where he directs the Center for South and Central Asia. Professor Eyal Zisser, the Vice Rector at the Tel Aviv University, who is a professor of contemporary history of the Middle East. Ambassador Dr. Sir John Jenkins, the former ambassador of Her Majesty to Saudi Arabia, and as he was also a senior Arabist at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, please. And last but not least, Professor Bingbing Wu, a prominent Chinese expert and scholar on the Middle East, on Islam, from Peking University. Thank you. Now, this is a dynamic session, which I have the privilege to moderate alongside General Gilad. I won't go into too many details. We will be directing questions to certain individuals, but we are opening this up to a discussion with two fingers rule. But before we start, oh, sorry, I apologize. Dr. Corey Shaki, sorry. Ooh, I missed it. Dr. Corey Shaki, I apologize. She's the Deputy Director of the IISS in London, but honestly, she is actually from the United States. Before people will be asking you about Britain, it's important to point out that she is originally from the United States, and we're happy to have her.
Spin one glass.
I would like to turn to the moderator, to Amos.
You're the chief. Thank you for coming. We would like to focus in this session on the very interesting question about the Middle East. We have been surprised many times and frequently about the Arab Spring, the end of the Arab Spring, about Daesh, ISIS, the stability. Sometimes they were more stable, the regimes, and sometimes less stable. And that's the purpose of this session. And I would like to ask Mr. Pardo, as the former head of Mossad, to share with us the picture he has in mind about the stability, the picture of the Middle East now. How do you see it? What are the risks and prospects?
Thank you. Well, it's an honor being here. Thank you for coming, for inviting me. I'll start around 16 years ago. I think that the invasion of the United States to Iraq ended a long era of equilibrium in the Middle East. The outcome of that invasion, that, by the way, was supported by part of the Israeli administration those times, I think was the biggest mistake, but the usual mistake. You know how to start the war, we having no idea how to end it. And from that time on, we can see it was like a domino since then until now. To that, we should add a few other things that brought us to a situation that I'm calling that we are living in an era of revolution. Let's think that if we were sitting here or in Paris 2 years after the French Revolution started, okay, 1791, in a coffee, we were thinking, oh, what a great day. We got rid of the monarchy there, and we are entering a great era of stability, but that was not the case. It took very, very long time, a lot of bloodshed, a lot of wars, until things stabilized more or brought the world to a better shape. Today we are living in an era of revolution in the Middle East. So there are ups and downs. We just discussed a year ago, we thought that things are getting better. We can see the end of, let's say, we thought we saw the end of ISIS. We saw stability. We understood the foreign policy of the Saudis and the Emirates to get out from Yemen as soon as possible. We thought that it might happen, but it didn't. We can see things now. I just got on the internet just an hour ago. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but that sister of our friend King Abdullah from Jordan, she is married to the Dubai sheikh there, and she escaped with her kids to London, asking her refuge in Germany, and we got some reasons. Interesting. Is it stability? No, it's not. Are we living in an era that brings us to peace or thinking of peace? Unfortunately, I don't think so.
Sir John, you've been following Saudi Arabia for many years. Mr. Pardo was speaking in generalities. What do you think the case is in Saudi Arabia?
For stability, you mean?
Oh, for instance.
You know, I think one of the lessons of the Arab Spring, of the revolutions, was that there was unexpected resilience in the monarchies of the Gulf. I mean, we were talking about this at the beginning, before we came out here, and I think Amos said that nobody had foreseen this. I like to think that I had, actually. I mean, nobody knows whether I did or not, but I'm going to claim that I did.
Oh.
And I think and it's an interesting question why. I mean, some of this is about legitimacy and a local legitimacy, which these rulers actually do have. But some of it is also about money, and some of it is about the way that that they have reconstructed tribal, a form of modern tribalism to sustain their rule. Now, just on Saudi Arabia in particular, I think the change between this dispensation and the one before 2014 is that this one is now more dependent on one person than previous dispensations were. And that's the danger. I mean, the previous system in Saudi Arabia was resilient partly because it was a family business. I think Mohammed bin Salman is trying to reconstruct a different form of family, his family. So he's a refounder of the family. But that's only started. And if you know, a'udhu billah, if Mohammed bin Salman were to disappear tomorrow, Allah, I think it's difficult to know who would take over. Before, you always knew who was going to take over. So the weakness is not actually at the bottom. The weakness is at the top. I think in the Emirates it's different. I think it is more distributed and more powerful. The same, I think, in Kuwait and to a certain extent Bahrain. But there is more resilience in these states. And they didn't see many disturbances. Some of this, there were some, and they bought them off. But by and large, but it's not just about money.
Yes, two fingers.
Well, I think that's a great assessment. I would just want to note, though, that some of them were bought off, and some of it was through brutal repression. So in the case of Bahrain, it was an uprising that was brutally shut down. So I think that's an important part of the story. But the story is not over, as we've seen in Algeria and Sudan. I think, Boaz, it's a very good question.
Ambassador Haqqani, yes.
I would say that while there is temporary stability in the monarchies, there is an inherent danger that the monarchies were always able to portray the unity of their people in the face of an enemy. And this time the enemy they have chosen is Iran, which is another Muslim country, but of a different sectarian orientation. So this could actually be the unleashing of sectarian forces, which may have certain inherent dangers that we may not recognize, and especially those who do not come from Muslim backgrounds may not understand how that could go on for a much longer time and may play out in ways that we cannot always anticipate.
So, John, were you disagreeing, or
no?
I wasn't sure
I hope we're going to talk about sectarianism in this debate, because it is powerful, it is interesting, but it's highly complex. It's not simply a Shia Sunni thing.
Absolutely.
And sectarianism is a modern constructed identity which is used by particular groups for mobilization in their own interests, and it can ebb as much as it can rise.
Yes.
I remember that Brett McGurk, when we have met first, he did have a map with, it was colored black, namely ISIS. When he retired, there were some black spots. Now the main question to you, the nightmare of ISIS is over?
No. Let me just back up a little bit to the first comments, and I want to, without naming names, a few years ago I was here in Israel, and a very senior officer in your defense forces, I said, hey, I'm going back to Washington, anything that you'd want me to bring back? And he said, we're actually looking over the Golan, and he said, yeah, no more American experiments. And what he meant was the invasion of Iraq, Assad must go policy, which was very controversial, I think led to some real chaos. Libya, just opening up these vacuums. So I think, as a former U.S. official, I think we have to look ourselves in the mirror at policies that really haven't gone particularly well. But there's a driver now, a fundamental underlying driver in the region, which is often missed by observers of the Middle East, I think nobody on this stage. But that is the tension between, for lack of better, but political Islam, Muslim Brotherhood, and more secular orientation, which is a wrong phraseology. But this is a bit of a great power competition in the region. And Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Turkey, Qatar, this is really driving a great deal, I think, of instability and something that is being missed. And U.S. policy right now is, in this region, is particularly one-dimensional, focused on Iran. I know this panel isn't about Iran, but there's so much more going on in the region that I'm just concerned that we're missing some things. But that trend in the Turkey, Qatar, and UAE, Egypt, Saudi is really driving an awful lot in the region right now, and it's often not paying attended to. Now, ISIS takes advantage of all of this. I think ISIS takes advantage of mayhem and maelstroms and vacuums. And I am particularly concerned. I think we did a good job at taking down the physical caliphate. That was far from a foregone conclusion. But we have to remain invested in that. And if we take our eye off that ball, they will be able to resurge. In Syria, just 30 seconds on this almost, but in Syria, obviously, I think we had a very good campaign plan, very limited U.S. investment, special forces. We were able to do things 4 or 5 years ago we could not have done 10 years ago. And with about 2,000 U.S. forces, defeated the physical caliphate, brought some real stability to northeast Syria, which gave us some real leverage in the overall Syria conflict. We're now reducing those forces. We've announced to the world that we don't have any intention to stay in Syria. President Trump announced that. I think that was quite damaging. So I think ISIS is kind of looking for ways to take advantage. I do not, though, share the view that they're going to come back like they did in 2014. We saw 40,000 foreign fighters pour into Syria from 2012, 13, 14, just mind-boggling. That was part of the Assad must go strategy, just opened up this big vacuum. It encouraged people from all around the world to pour into Syria. I think those days are over. But the terrorist threat is still there. And just final point, and one thing you hear in Washington is that the counterterrorism missions have now been, they might have been first tier a few years ago. They're now third, fourth tier. We're in an era of great power competition with Russia and China. I think that's right. In the region, we're very focused on Iran, which is right, but I think we can talk about the best way to go about it. But you're always one attack away from al-Qaeda or ISIS from that fundamentally changing. So that counterterrorism challenge will be with us for a long time, and I think it's something that we really have to stay focused on, even as we look at everything else happening here in this part of the world.
Professor Zisser, you were about to say something.
Yes. First of all, I think that only in the West and in Israel, people still speak about the Arab Spring. Nobody in the region speak about the Arab Spring. Was there an Arab Spring? No, there was not. I mean, we don't need to look at the Middle East as one unit. Iraq, Syria had to do with what happened in 2003, the invasion of Iraq. Egypt is a different story. Tunisia is a different story. The Middle East is unstable by its nature. It was always unstable. What we witness in Egypt, in Tunisia, even in Libya, now in Sudan, is the problem of transition when you have an old ruler disconnected from reality, how to transfer the regime into new hands. Eventually, they overcame this problem, and it is behind us. But the region is unstable. Any foreign interference, as we witness in Iraq or as we witness in Libya, can lead to collapse of state. But that's, as I say, if we look back at the history of the region, that's what we always witness. And somehow most of the countries were able to overcome this challenge. What I see significant for the future is indeed the foreign interference of not foreign actors, but Iran and Turkey, which for so many years were outside, under Nasser and after Nasser, were outside of this game, and now, because of the weakening of the Arab system, are getting inside.
You talked about, we mentioned now Syria, we mentioned Saudi Arabia, Iraq, but coming closer to home, as we would wish, we left out one kingdom, Jordan. Is anybody willing to discuss the stability, the challenges facing the Hashemite kingdom?
I will. I'm actually amazed that Jordan has held up as well as it has under the pressure of refugees from Syria, under the pressure of the instabilities in the region. And I think, first of all, we should all be helping Jordan more than we are, because if Jordan isn't able to sustain its role in the region and its own domestic stability, we are all going to regret that terribly. A second thing is that the pressure that even the kingdoms of the Gulf are under. I mean, the Saudis are copying the Emiratis in the hopes of creating economic dynamism that will produce stability. And without the governance component, I think even the Saudis are going to be in a lot of trouble. And so I agree that we're in a revolutionary era, but I think you may be even closer to the truth. This is a region that has never been stable and is not going to be stable until it comes up with economic and governance solutions that legitimate the leadership better in the eyes of most of the people. Jordan has done that better than any place else has done that and deserves a lot more support from us for it.
Mr. Pardo?
I agree. This area was never stable, but I think that the situation has been changed. We are living in a transparent world. We are living in, let's say, one big commune that things are moving from one side of the world to the other side within seconds and minutes. Though we saw that reaction, that what we used to call the Arab Spring or the instability from 2011 to 2014, more or less. But on Jordan is a miracle. I don't think that there was any country in the world that can maintain the regime of what Jordan suffered. From 2003, the invasion of Iraqi, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi that moved from Iraq to Jordan. Then the next move, all the Syrian that moved in. So the Jordanian economy that's supposed to support, let's say, between a third and half of the population that are living now in Jordan, they did with nothing, with no support from the West, with no support from the United Nations, with no support from the Emirates and the Saudis, proper support, and that it's through the wisdom, I believe, of the kingdom there, of the king.
Dr. Kaye?
Yeah, just a couple. I want to second Corey's and all of the points about how important Jordan is and how deserving it is of support, but to add a couple more layers of stress, this is your most critical neighbor here. I'm very worried. I would put Jordan at the top of my list to be worried about, because it's not just the strain of the refugees, which is severe, and the previous Iraqi refugee situation and the economy. There has been great instability, rioting over the last year, and we have to say it here, the U.S. administration's proposed peace plan is getting the Jordanians very worried. It's under existing stress, and it's facing an administration, unclear what the peace plan is, but the discussion and narrative around the peace plan is leading some Jordanians to believe it is about integrating the Palestinians into the broader region, and Jordan would be the first address. So I think I was in Jordan in April, and I could feel it in the air. It was a lot of concern and stress within the country, but also because of these external pressures and policy decisions, frankly, coming out of Washington.
Yeah. We'll come back to the role of Washington and the global powers. But Sir John?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on this issue. And this is an issue relating to Jordan, but it's more wide in the region. I mean, this region has been in a revolutionary state or a pre-revolutionary state since about 1919, since Aglugal's abortive revolution in 1919. This is Gramscian. This is the old cannot die, the new cannot be born. In the meantime, we see a variety of morbid symptoms, and we've been seeing that since the 1920s. There is an issue of governance, but if you, and I will use the term Arab Spring, not because I agree with you, but it's shorthand, and it means I don't have to talk about every individual country. If you look broadly at what people seem to have wanted from polling and from the people they voted for when they had elections after 2011, people wanted a better life. They wanted services, they wanted clean water, they wanted gas, they wanted education for their kids. If you look at the protests down in Basra over the last couple of years, the protests in Iran over the last couple of years, it's the same things they talk about. And at the heart of this is corruption. Because the thing that stops these things being provided is corruption. And corruption is not an epiphenomenon. It's not accidental. It is structural. If you look at the way that the prominent Shia militias, the Iran-related Shia militias in Iraq, have hijacked the resources of the state, or in the process of hijacking the resources of the state, in the same way as Hezbollah has sought to do in Lebanon, the militias in Libya are doing, and indeed the Basij and the Revolutionary Guards do in Iran. That's structural, and it's the same pattern. And everybody talks about getting rid of corruption. This is our central task. I was talking to Barton Sali the other day, and he says this. Eyal Abdel Mahdi says it in Iraq. Everybody says it. Nobody can do it. And this is an issue in Jordan as well, because it's about social justice, and it's about distribution of wealth and jobs. And there's an issue, and this enables Islamist parties to capture the high ground, because one of the striking features of the Middle East, the way in which people talk about these problems in the Middle East, it may start with secular discussions about governance and economics, but it shifts very rapidly to the Islamist right, because that's where the language is in which you talk about this. And this is a perfect storm, it seems to me. It's a slow-motion storm, or a slow-motion car crash, and it's been going on for decades, but none of us have actually really got a clue of how to address this.
If I understand correctly, perhaps a different way to present this is the debate and the discussion about what should we prefer.
Yep.
Should we prefer stability? Should we prefer regimes that we don't necessarily that much like? Or should we unleash forces, democratic forces?
Can I just one very small point? Yes. And we are going to face this issue, particularly over reconstruction in Syria, and indeed reconstruction in Iraq. Because the issue, if we don't do anything about that, and it churns my guts to think that we're going to help Assad rebuild the country, but if we don't do it, Hezbollah will do it, the warlords in Syria will do it, Iran will do it, and that's not a good look.
Amos, you want to address that dilemma?
I do have my perspective that we need to prefer to prioritize the stability because we cannot change the Middle East. Unfortunately, we have tried reform, democracy, and we got the Muslim brothers. Thank you very much. Not you. Thank you.
I didn't.
Thanks a lot. The Muslim brothers are nightmare. And we are living on miracles. I call it secular miracles. The moment that President Zisser has taken a decision after he swore on Quran to be loyal to the Muslim brothers, and everybody knows what are the Muslim brothers.
Yeah.
I mean, he has taken decision to defeat them and to save Egypt from the nails of this monster. If he didn't do it, where would we? I mean, we would be under danger, at least Israel. So my conclusion is very reactionary, very conservative, that what we can do is to keep the stability of this regime in spite of all the fundamental problems. In Egypt, for example, they do have many fundamental problems, but the stability is strategic asset to the whole Middle East. I cannot imagine the Middle East with the Muslim brothers, with alliance with Turkey. Can you imagine it? We have experienced it. It was enough. And since General Sisi, President Sisi has taken decision to put them in jail, in spite of pressure by US and so on, I think Turkey, another, let's say, potentially dangerous country, is shrinking. So my terrible conclusion is to keep the stability as we can, because we cannot solve the fundamental problems. Nobody can. And we must not, this is the last remark, we must not patronize and force our logics on them. It will not work.
Amos, I would argue that the reason why the Muslim Brotherhood became what it became as a major force, because it was nothing in the 1950s compared to what it has become now in terms of popularity, is because some people decided that the stability they wanted to enforce in the Middle East had to exclude communists and leftists, and that was the major issue. Absolutely. And that resulted in the Muslim Brotherhood rising. So we should, I'm all for the argument that there should be stability, but we should be mindful of what are we ignoring. In a forum like this, we should think about what are we encouraging when we are suppressing one thing. Will there be something else? So for example, I always say this, that Al-Qaeda was Jihad 1.0. ISIS was Jihad 2.0. Why do we think there will not be Jihad 3.0? So we have to be prepared to understand the internal and natural dynamics of the region. I also agree with the notion that historically this has not been a stable region, but stability has either come through the imposition of an empire or by letting people be, one of the two things. And if the first is not possible, the second has to be done with a lot of mindfulness of the nuances. So for example, Sir John's point was very relevant, that it is important to understand the nuance. You can't just say all monarchy is good, all dictatorships bad, or vice versa. We have to be very nuanced about this region, because one thing that is special to this region is that one place, what works in one place does not work in another. What works in Bahrain may not work for Qatar. What works for Saudi Arabia may not work for Jordan. And what works for Egypt may not work in Sudan.
So one quick point, which is I am less persuaded than you are, Amos, that the repression that President Sisi is bringing in Egypt is going to equate to stability, even in the midterm. And even if it does equate to stability, the price we are paying for that is very steep and could likely be destabilizing in and of itself.
And just to echo Sir John, I think also almost if you don't deal with the underlying reasons for the instability that you'd like to stabilize, especially corruption and inequities and repression, it's not solving everything, but if you don't deal with those, you're going to have a 3.0, 4.0, 5.0, endless radicalization in this region. So it's time to think a little bit, how can we try to reverse this cycle? We're not going to solve everything at once. We're not going to solve everything everywhere. But we need some new logic.
Can I ask a question of one of my panel members? I'm a professor from Peking University. I was in Beijing, I don't know, a couple months ago. And I met your Middle East team at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I was struck by everything we're talking about. That's for the region to solve. China has a policy here in the region of being strategic partners at the highest level with Iran, with Saudi Arabia, with UAE and Egypt. You're good friends with Israel. You're good friends with everybody. My response was that is a pretty high-wired walk over the longer term, and is it possible? And the answer I got, we are all about investment, win-win solutions, and I just found it difficult to see how you'll be able to maintain that. I know you're not speaking for the Chinese government, but I'd be interested, as China emerges here in the region, how China will deal with all of these complicated problems we're dealing with. So having you on the panel, I thought it would be very interested to hear your views.
Thank you for the questions. I think based on Chinese understanding, the whole region is in transition on two levels. The transition of the regional order. There are competitions among the regional powers over the dominant role in the region. And also second level is nation building or nation rebuilding. I think people mention Saudi Arabia, so we cannot ignore Qatar, the nation building after the blockade, and UAE also a nation building to have a more centralized non-federalist government and also regional ambitions. And then we can look at Syria also. It's also a process of nation building, like, a new national identity, the capability of government, and also I think the institutional construction of the nation. So I think, based on this process, I think there are so many competitions, conflicts, in the region and among the countries, I think. So China hasn't issued any strategy towards the region, but I think several elements could be observed. First, China prefer cooperation with countries outside the region, in the region. China-U.S. had some talks over the region during the Obama administration. China-Russians, have cooperation, China-Europeans. And second element, I think China would have a balanced relations with the countries in the region. Either is Islamic countries, non-Islamic countries, regional powers, middle-sized, small-sized countries, Shia, Sunni. We don't take side. And third element is China insists in the political principles like respect of sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-intervention, especially non-military intervention. And the fourth element is China has an advantage, as you mentioned, focusing on the economic development. We think without economic development, the countries cannot be stabilized. And then there is a more and more focus on the security and military issues in the region because there are increasing Chinese overseas interests in this region. I think if there's a last element, we can say that based on what I made the analysis, that China support a strong state construction process in the region, including strong political, military, security institutions, and clear economic visions plus workable economic agendas. Yeah.
So, yes.
I wanted to make 2 short points. First of all, I think that we made too much of political Islam. I think that we spoke about it, how dangerous it is. It was defeated. I mean, look at what happened during the last 10 years. It was defeated in Tunisia. It was defeated in Egypt. It was defeated in Syria. Even in Iraq it didn't do well. The only place is Gaza, thanks to Israel. I mean, Israel is the one that keeps political Islam. Yes, Turkey to a certain degree, even after what happened in Istanbul, but political Islam is not the monster we tend to speak about it. The other thing, the discourse about we need to do this, we need to do that. I mean, the Middle East has its uniqueness. I don't guess that a panel about Russia will speak about we need to change Russia, or about China. I mean, the Middle East has its uniqueness, we need to accept it. Any effort to interfere, to try and reconstruct and rebuild Israel in Lebanon, the United States in Iraq, in Libya, failed totally. I mean, it's not because of the Americans that the Arab Spring erupted, and it's not because of the Americans that Sisi took power. It's not because of the Americans that the riots started in Syria. So we have to understand how limited we are in our ability to change things, to interfere into things. We have to accept reality on the ground and maneuver, not more than that.
So,
no, I find the Chinese role extremely interesting because there's an undercurrent to it. I think there's a view. Ottoman Empire, UK until 1956 that didn't go very well. US 1956 until now hasn't really gone very well. And I think what I hear from the Chinese is that they have a new model, and let's try this model. And frankly, the mood in America and the American people are like, okay, over to somebody else, which also I think is dangerous. So I think this trend line of as China emerges, as Russia obviously is becoming a more active player here to say the least, how the U.S. deals with that. Do we see the Middle East as an arena of competition with China and Russia? Do we see areas where we can cooperate? I mean, these are kind of big questions that we're going to have to deal with together.
But, Mr. Pardo, you wanted to add something?
From the 50s up to the early 70s, we had 2 great powers that dominated their region. And I can't say they didn't create stability, but they lowered the flames in many cases. And you could have seen it. After the 70s, we had 1 great power that dominated the place, the United States. In recent years, we don't see anyone who's dominated the area. There's no one that's trying to lower the flames. And now we have, okay, China with their ambition, okay? We have Russia that came back thanks to some moves, or wrong moves from my point of view, when the United States let them in full, let's say, in full power to Syria. And we still don't see what's the vision or the foreign policy of the United States toward the Middle East. We see something against Iran, but that's their policy? Is that their policy? I don't know. But the reaction in the last 2 weeks, I don't understand what is the American policy even towards Iran. And that's going to be a great, great problem to the Middle East.
So I think you are accurately reading American policy in the Middle East. It is the right read not to understand what the administration is doing. I think two overriding principles, though. The first is that they want a lot less American involvement in the Middle East. And the second, they are largely indifferent to what the cost is of that reduced involvement to the countries in the region, even including to Israel. What I would be worried about if I were you is a replay of the Trump administration's North Korea policy, which is a deal with Iran that does not restrain their nuclear ambitions, that does not change the threats they pose to shipping in the Gulf, to destabilization of regional countries, to promotion of terrorism, all of those things. But President Trump will trumpet it as the best deal ever because it allows him to even further walk away from caring about what's happening.
But is there a change between Trump and Obama? Obama did the same. I mean, yes, he signed an agreement, but his policy was the same. Let's get out of the Middle East, isn't it?
I would agree with that. I would think that there is a continuum in policy. I think it started with President Obama. From the left, it's continuing from the right with President Trump. The only difference, of course, is that there was no risk in case of President Obama that Khamenei could tweet and say, I so love you that I want to meet you tomorrow, and there would be an invitation the very next day. That fear is something new right now. And I don't know why Khamenei hasn't thought of doing that so far.
Yes, but I just want to interject and go back for a moment to China, because when I was listening to Professor Wu and his, I would say, cautious characterization of the Chinese policy in the Middle East, it didn't sound so different from the U.S. tendencies in the Middle East. Perhaps it's we're left with Russia, who actually wants a more advanced or more invested approach in the Middle East. Yeah, Dalia.
Well, I think, Russia is really the game changer in the Middle East today. Its intervention in Syria, I think you're absolutely right, in 2015, is really shaping the map. But I think just like we have to distinguish between differences in Middle East states and Arab world in particular, we also need to distinguish between the role of Russia and China. They're very different powers. As some of my colleagues at RAND put it in a recent paper, China is a peer, a strategic competitor, second largest economy in the world. Russia's a rogue, not a peer. It's a disruptor, 11th economy, far less economic potential. Right now, Russia looks like the big winner in the Middle East. It came in, it saved Assad. With Iranian support, of course, the two work in tandem. But I would argue they're really different actors. China, and I think that's what I heard from you, although I'd love to hear more. I'm also very interested. In America these days, China's kind of the focus of our interest because of how strategic you seem to be. You have a Belt and Road Initiative. It's very strategic. It's very long-term. It looks mostly economic now. Russia, on the other hand, is short-term. It's opportunistic, just like ISIS was opportunistic. Russia takes advantage of U.S. and other actors' missteps, whether it's after the Gulf 2003 war, whether it's after the 2011 uprisings, taking advantage in Syria of the gap that the U.S. left there, or whether it's the U.S.-Turkish tension and delivery of missile systems. All of this is very opportunistic and short-term. I am not one, and I know President Obama got in a lot of trouble for this when he said, they're going to pay a price for this intervention in Syria, and so far it doesn't look like they paid a price. But the story's not over. They are, I think, they're under economic pressure. Reconstruction in Syria by UN estimates would be $250 billion. Who's paying that bill? Russia is linked to the hip now with very difficult regional allies. Iran being on top of the list there in Syria, not going to be easy to get itself out of that situation and keep Assad there. The story's not over. So I think we need to be very careful about equating Russia and China and overinflating the long-term threat of Russia in the Middle East. The challenge, though, is what is the U.S. going to do about it? And that's where I don't think we have good answers. The most important thing we can do is to stop the strategic mistakes.
So what is China going to do about it, first of all?
First, I think China believes Middle East is a place of cooperation, not a place of competition or conflict. That's why I think President Xi made this.
You mean among the global powers, not among
with the countries outside the region, in the region. I mean, China, U.S., China, Russia, China, European. Yeah, because President Xi Jinping made it very clear during his speech in the headquarters of Arab League during his visit to Egypt that China doesn't seek to fill any vacuum because there is no vacuum. China doesn't want to have any sphere of influence or to have any agent in the region. It's very clear. And secondly, I believe that, to stabilize the region is for the interest of China and for the interest of all. But China can do more in economic development. Maybe U.S. can do something else, Russia can do something else, but different countries have different advantages. So, my colleague mentioned this BRI. I think it's a long-term initiative, including industrialization, infrastructure construction, financing sector, energy sector, and other issues. So I think, it's just China do what it can do in the best way to stabilize this region, I think. Yeah.
So, John?
Yeah, just quickly. I think if you think about the Middle East in about 2005, it was the sort of place we all thought we understood. Now we don't think we understand it. The option of doing nothing, I know this is US policy. I know this is the mood in the US, and it's a mood elsewhere as well. But what happens in the Middle East has extraordinary consequences. I think of Europe, and I'm British, and we're still in Europe, in the EU, just about. And the explosion of the migrant crisis after 2011 had a massively damaging impact on European politics, which have basically changed the whole picture of the European Union and what people think. And that's not just about Europe. That's also about what we used to call the global order and the rest of it. Europe used to rely on the US to keep all this in order. And the problem now, you have US, Russia, China, all pursuing different objectives in the middle. It's stopped making sense. And there is nobody bringing this together.
I just want to interject because we don't usually have this discussion, at least not in Israel. And this is another external player with close links to China, and which, well, the Americans used to call it part of the broader Middle East, but it's on the border of the Middle East. It's Pakistan. And when we look down into the future, or actually the rather near future, Pakistan has a role or a potential role to play in this region and its attitudes towards Israel.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me just begin by saying that Pakistan is not in the Middle East, but it is a wannabe Middle East power. It has always wanted to be part of the Middle East. That's why they joined CENTO, they joined MEDO, the Middle East Defense Organization, way back. The British, as they were leaving the subcontinent, they convinced the Pakistani elite that, your future belongs with the Middle East, not with India. I personally, of course, have a very different view, but that doesn't really matter. Your title, that Pakistan is a potential strategic nightmare, nuclear weapons, only 54% literacy, very young population, almost half of the young population not going to any kind of school, second largest out-of-school population in the world after Nigeria, an economy that is sort of on the brink constantly, hardly $7.5 billion foreign exchange reserves, constantly having to ask for money from either China or Saudi Arabia or UAE or potentially down the road from Turkey and Iran. You might remember that the Pakistani nuclear scientist, Dr. A.Q. Khan, was the man who sold the centrifuges to Iran. What if in a future...
And to Libya, if I'm not mistaken.
And to Libya as well. And so what is stopping us from thinking through? Then we have a military that dominates the political arena, refuses to allow civilians to have enough of a say. And the military is totally focused on competition with India. So what happens when their desire for competition with India makes them reliant on Middle Eastern oil-rich countries to the point where they say, okay, if you give us money, we help you with missiles and nukes. And that is a real nightmare scenario. I hope it's not going to happen anytime in the future, but it is certainly not something that people should ignore.
All right. Let's, before we wrap up, and the clock is ticking, we want to look a bit forward, Amos. Talk about game changers, black swans. You can see it also in front of you, Amos. We're talking about one of the more recent, I would say, developments is this Arab-Israeli strategic partnership that Bahrain, the workshop in Bahrain showed last week. Is it going to last forever? Amos, you want to kick that off?
We will not last forever. I think, really, seriously, this is some kind of miracle that nobody has expected decades ago, that we would be partners, strategic partners of the Arab world. And I think we are partners, whether you like it or not, with the conservative states, and not with the so-called democratic that will never be, or states like Syria that are not states. That's our partnership, security partnership, defense partnership, intelligence, technological, that has potential of developing, is great asset for Israel, and gives Israel many advantages, so it gives advantages to the Arab world. On the other hand, I'm very worried that there is no normalization. And without solving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I cannot foresee any real normalization. That's my opinion. If I'm right, I hope I'm wrong, it means it's like tree with one root. We need trees, forests with many roots. Otherwise, we will be subject to political hurricanes that might happen and might visit us sooner or later. Maybe it will take 10 years or 15 years. That's what you asked about eternal. And we need to work on it. For example, if the Palestinian Authority collapses, I think it will have dramatic impact on Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. That's nightmare. Jordan for Israel gives strategic depths until the border between Iraq and Jordan. So my best wishes to Israel to continue to deepen, to widen, to upgrade our cooperation, security, strategic cooperation, but it's not enough. We need to find out the Achilles heel, the weak points, and the top of them that I'm very worried is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's why I'm worried about the Trump bargain, because it might lead us to some crisis in our relationship. Because I cannot imagine Saudi Arabia signing agreement with Israel without the Palestinians. No. Maybe Mohammed bin Salman can dream of it. However, for that he has a father. Even he's not so young as he used to be, he is still powerful to prevent it. I cannot imagine Egypt, and the ambassador of Egypt has shared with us the vision of Egypt, and so on. Thank you.
Mr. Pardo.
Unfortunately, if you want to sell agricultural products, medical devices, energy solutions to any Arab country, you are unable to do it. Unable. If you want to do it, you should whiten your product to a third country. Why? It's fine to sell military intelligence because that's for that stuff you can buy it below the radar with the knowledge of few people. But if you try to sell something, and I asked many, many leaders in our region, why you don't buy our products, our technology, it can be a great benefit to your people. The answer is always the same. Palestinian problem, Palestinian conflict. So when we are discussing the Arab-Israeli strategic partnership, it's a limited one. If we will not move towards some kind of a solution, I'm afraid that as we are living in a very windy area, the things are changing very fast. We must find ourselves without that strategic partnership, because a real partnership is partnership between people, not only between the leaders.
I will resist the temptation to ask you which of the leaders you spoke with and gave you that answer. But we need to look into the future as we come to the close of this session. You've been all, how would I say, not very optimistic. You spoke about dilemmas that are difficult to solve, if at all, if it is possible to solve those dilemmas. You spoke about the limited role of the United States, of Europe, to some extent of China, and you mentioned the adventurism of Russia. You spoke about the limits of the Israeli or the Western connection in the region. And we will talk about it in much more detail tomorrow, the malignant or the pragmatic influence of Iran in the region. So what do we do down the road? What do we look for? What surprises might, because people were talking about number 3, number 4, so what are we looking for?
I have one. I think we are not worried enough about regime change in Iran resulting either from the death of Khamenei and a messy succession, or internal pressures, or the stress of economic sanctions on Iran, producing a worse, more belligerent, more malignant Iranian government than we have now. Imagine Soleimani as running Iran. I think it could get so much worse than we are imagining it could get.
So, John,
I think I agree with everything that's been said. One of the things that really makes a difference is economic integration. I think, we've spoken about this. And if you look, and this is not economic integration with everybody, but it's economic integration of Iraq with the Gulf states, or the key Gulf states, with Saudi Arabia, with Kuwait and the Emirates, with Egypt, with Jordan, and with Israel. That's the key economic bloc at the heart of this. At the heart of this is energy markets, is an integrated energy market, which people have talked about in the Gulf for 50 years and has never happened. They send everything out, but there's a shortage of gas, actually, in Saudi Arabia. Iraq flares most of its gas in the south. Now, it needs a lot of this for power generation itself, but there is surplus. You can imagine, you tie this block, that's the new Baghdad Pact.
All right. Dalia?
Are we going in order? And by the way, Lebanon and Israel seem to be on the verge of an energy agreement. So it's not all bad news. And in fact, I would say here that this country should be a little more supportive, actually, of a stable Lebanon. I know it's often conflated with Hezbollah, but there are counters to Hezbollah that need to be bolstered, and things like energy are a good mechanism to do it. But I just want to add, it's so easy to come up with dire game changers in the Middle East. A very big number. What's that? Okay, which is why I want to come up with a more positive one, even though it's unlikely to happen. But I think a big game changer would be if a combination of what I was discussing on eventual Russian retrenchment from the Middle East for a variety of domestic and other pressures, and maybe smarter U.S. policies, combined with unknown events that could lead to potential regime change or current leaders shifting their policies, and here I'll be very specific, Saudi and Emirati regional activism. If we see a moving away from interventions and escalation along the blocks that Brett was talking about earlier, and focusing more inward on their youth populations and their 2030 plans, which is really what's going to get them stable in the future, then we may have the potential to build on peace processes like in Yemen. Syria is going to be more difficult, but it would lower the temperature in the region. I think there's a real possibility for that if we can get those actors to scale back.
I have to stop. Do you share the optimism?
I think there's a role for diplomacy right now. I think the U.S. is absent. I think our policy is very one-dimensional. I think we have no off-ramp right now with Iran. I think we're on a collision course. But there is a role for real diplomacy. When I travel around Yemen, there's a desire to end the Yemen war. Iraq, there's a new government that is far from perfect, but that is being embraced by everyone from Saudi Arabia to Iran to Turkey to Jordan. That is a real opportunity. Other flashpoints that were red hot not long ago have died down. There is a role for U.S. diplomacy to help de-escalate while we keep some pressure on our adversaries. But right now we're not doing that. We're playing a very one-dimensional game, and I think increasing the risk throughout the region.
Mr. Pardo.
When we were kids, we played Monopoly. The name of the game...
Do, by the way. My kids still do. It's not...
That's good. As we played Monopoly, we understood that the name of the game is economy. And in this world, the only real players in Monopoly are the Chinese. So watch them, because they, by their attitude, they can lower the flames in the way that others didn't do. So watch them.
I was worried he was going to say it's a real estate game, which I think
on the positive side, the game changer could be water and energy concerns, making people actually talk to each other rather than continuously fight with one another. On the negative side, I think that we should watch out for an Arab reaction to the fact that the Arab role is diminishing, not increasing. Unless, of course, Prince Mohammed bin Salman can deliver on the hopes that he has engendered with Saudi Arabia. The Arab role is diminishing. Iran, Turkey, my own country, Pakistan, the Europeans, Russia, America, none of them are Arab. And there might be a reaction within the region among Arabs based on that feeling of marginalization.
I don't see any big changes in the coming years. I think that, unfortunately, I fear to say that the status quo is sustainable. After the collapse of the Arab Spring, I mean, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, people believe in Israel and among the Palestinians that they can live with. I'm afraid that we'll wake up in 2050, when in the region there will be 750 million people. It will be a demographical catastrophe for Europe, because those people will go to Europe, and for Israel, because of the balance between Jews and Palestinians in Israel.
Thank you. Professor Wu.
I think we can compare the Middle East to Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia is very, cultural and social diversified, very chaotic in the 1950s until 1990s maybe. But still, look at the current situation. So I think we should be very optimistic. I think the role of ASEAN could be, duplicated in the region. If there's a real regional security arrangement to work, in the region to include all the countries in the region, I think it could be a very good platform for countries to discuss over the conflicts.
Thank you very much. General Gilad.
Thank you.
No, but the final word, you can't get out of that.
The word that I'm optimistic about our relationship with the stable regimes. We cannot solve all the problems. For the time being, we need to do our best not to destroy it. I mentioned it. We do have the time that is over. Thank you very much, Tommy. Thank you, all of you. It was very fruitful and inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Off you go.
Amos?